Welcome back to another review of Eerie, Indiana. If you're new here, I've been doing a review of every single episode of Eerie, Indiana, so if you want to check out previous episodes I've done, feel free to. This episode is called The Dead Letter, and is episode 9, which makes the halfway point of the series. Anyway, let's get right into it. This episode originally aired on November 10th, 1991, and was directed by Tim Hunter, who's known for The Failures, River's Edge, and The Saint of Fort Washington. The episode starts off with Marshall and Simon hanging out at the World of Stuff because the Eerie Library is having a sale on old books, so they dump some of them at the World of Stuff. Simon has to go through them for his history report. Marshall is bored and wants to leave. He then notices the girl he has a crush on and tells Simon he'd like to meet her, but is basically too shy to go up to her. Simon then takes it upon himself to get her for Marshall. Simon yells at the girl, but Marshall panics and hides by a bookshelf. He tells Simon that he's dead, as Simon is laughing. Marshall opens the book he was holding and finds some undelivered letter made out for Mary B. Carter. They notice the old stamp on it, and Marshall thinks maybe it's an old letter written on someone's deathbed, and has old secrets no one's heard before. Simon suggests to do the right thing and mail it, but Marshall says no and decides to open the letter. As soon as Marshall opens the letter, a gust of wind goes through the World of Stuff, and when it stops, they notice a guy sitting at the top of the bookshelf. His name is Trip McConnell, who was played by none other than Spider-Man himself, Tobey Maguire. Marshall has no idea where he came from, or if he's a ghost or not. Trip comes down the shelf and tells Marshall he wants him to do him a favor. Marshall declines immediately and places the letter on the table and leaves with Simon. Trip then looks at the letter and it starts to spin. That night, Marshall says something weird was going on at his house with his family. It cuts to Marshall's family in a trance or a spell caused by Trip. Marshall's family is in amazement at Trip and his life. They even offer Trip to live with them. And of course, Trip accepts the offer. Marshall comes in at that moment, and his family tells Marshall why they never told him about Trip before. Marshall tells his family he has to talk to Trip outside, and him and Simon take him outside. Once outside, they ask Trip who he is and what he wants. Trip responds and tells him, "Is that any way to talk to an old friend?" Marshall tells him he's never seen him before in his life, and now he's in there making his family into idiots. Then Trip responds,
Mars, come on. It's not that hard to do.
Marshall then wants to punch him, but Simon stops him. Trip says all he wants is Marshall to help him with a little problem he has. He tells Marshall he's in love with the most wonderful girl. Marshall then tells him he thinks he's trouble and wants nothing to do with him or any girl he knows, and him and Simon leave him outside. Trip then stares at the letter and burns it up in his hand and says he'll be back. Later on at dinner, Marshall's family is sad that Trip is gone. Marshall tells him that he's not friends with Trip and that it's as if Trip appeared to him for the first time in his life. Then Cindy asks Marshall if he's suggesting Trip as a ghost. Marshall tells him not to let Trip in the house anymore. Then Marshall sees Trip appear outside by the window. His family, still in the spell, race outside to see if Trip is outside still. Marshall is starting to get creeped out by the situation. Later that night, in Marshall's dream, he sees everyone, but they are being really weird. His family is riding a bicycle in the air in place. Simon has a suit and is laughing. Marshall's crush is swinging around in a swing. But then Trip appears in his dream. Marshall tries to wake up, but Trip tells him not yet, not until he tells him what he wants him to do. Marshall tells his dream parents to tell Trip to leave him alone, but they just respond with,
"But we love Trip. We love Trip more than we love you."
Then he asks Simon for help, which Simon replies with,
Oh, I just hate being second banana on the show.
What show?
I love how this is a self-aware line that refers directly to the show. Anyway, Trip tells Marshall that he wants him to deliver his letter because he's the one that found it. He has to be the person to deliver it in person. Marshall tells him he doesn't have his letter. Trip tells him to look at his nightstand when he wakes up. Marshall then wakes up and notices the letter on his nightstand. Later on, Marshall tells Simon the story, and Simon thinks it's weird, even for Marshall. They approach the house, and Simon tells Marshall to just leave it, but Marshall tells Simon he has to deliver it in person, and knocks on the door, thinking it will all go away as soon as he delivers it. A young girl answers the door, and she was played by Amy Brooks, who was known for Monster Man, Days of Our Lives, and Critters 3. Marshall asks if she's Mary Carter. She answers yes, and Marshall gives her the letter and tells her it's given him a lot of trouble, but he hopes it brings her happiness and begins to leave thinking he's a free man. But then Mary says the letter is for Mary B. Carter and that she's Mary C. Carter. She tells him that they must want her aunt. She lets him inside and head over to Mary B. Carter's room. Mary C. Carter tells her aunt that there's two young men here to give her a letter. Marshall and Simon approach her bed and introduce themselves to her. Mary then laughs at the fact that she has a letter.
Don't make me laugh. I haven't had a letter since the dawn of the last ice age. Yes, ma'am.
Marshall tells her that the letter is from Trip McConnell, which makes Mary get up. We see Mary, and she was actually played by Hera Ware. She was known for Cocoon, but sadly has passed away in 2005. Marshall hands her the letter, but she instantly throws it back, and Marshall and Simon are puzzled. Mary threatens to beat them up with her cane. Marshall asks what's wrong. She then responds saying that Trip should have been her husband, but that he's been dead for 62 years. Marshall and Simon realize that Trip is in fact a ghost. Mary starts swinging her cane, hitting some statue. Marshall and Simon take off running out of her house. Mary is seen then crying after. Later on, knowing that Trip is a ghost, Marshall and Simon are placing garlic all over the house for protection. Simon asks why he's haunting Marshall, and Marshall thinks it has something to do with him opening the letter, like letting a genie out of the lamp. As they are putting garlic in the attic, Trip appears to them. They hold up their garlic at him, which makes Trip laugh, and tells him garlic is for vampires. Marshall and Simon put down the garlic, realizing Trip is right. Trip asks them about his letter. Marshall tells him he delivered it, but that Mary didn't want it. Marshall tells Trip that she's an old lady now, and not the girl he used to know. Trip begins to cry, thinking that Mary doesn't want him. As he cries, snow begins to fall on him, which makes Marshall tell him to stop. Trip apologizes and says he's a walking disaster. Even the way he died was stupid. It cuts to 1929, and we see a young Mary walking out of the library, and Trip wanting to talk to her, but was too shy, so he wrote her a letter instead. He was on his way to deliver it, but he was so in love he didn't see where he was going, or that milk truck that seems to be notorious for running over kids, just like the Heart on a Chain episode. Now Trip is not allowed to go past the spot he was killed, so he asks Marshall for help one last time. He tells him he has been waiting for 62 years, and once that letter is delivered, he can rest. Trip makes the letter reappear in Marshall's hand. That night, Marshall goes over to Mary's house once again. Simon is in a disguise and knocks on the door, conducting a fake survey just to distract young Mary, while Marshall gets a ladder to climb the window into Mary's room. Marshall climbs in, and Mary hears someone and shouts she has a gun, which spooks Marshall. Mary turns on the light and sees Marshall, and Marshall begins to tell her the story of the letter and how he died delivering the letter. Mary starts to call the police, but Marshall reads the letter out loud to Mary. Mary begins to listen, and Marshall ends the letter with Trip saying to meet him at the World of Stuff. Mary hangs up the phone, and Marshall hands her the letter. Mary begins to laugh, calling Trip corny, but in a lovable way. Marshall tells Mary to meet him, and they climb out the window. Mary then sees Marshall's bike and gets a little nervous, but as they race towards the World of Stuff with Mary riding on the handlebars, they arrive at the World of Stuff, and Marshall calls out to Trip, but Trip doesn't appear. Mary then thinks it's because he's expecting a 13-year-old version of herself, and that instead he's getting a faded old bat. As she's about to leave, Trip appears, and sees Mary as her younger self. Trip tells Mary that he was thinking of not showing up because he was so nervous. Mary asks how Trip has been, and Trip says he's been kinda dead. He then asks Mary how she's been, and she says, kinda old. But Trip tells her she's still beautiful. Trip asks Mary if she's ever married anyone, and Mary says 6 times.
Mary.
But she tells Trip they didn't work out because they weren't him. Marshall and Simon leave Trip and Mary to be alone. The next day, everything seemed to be back to normal, including that weird spell over Marshall's family. But everything tastes like garlic, and their clothes smell like garlic too. They kinda assume Marshall's behind it. Just then, Simon barges in and tells Marshall that something happened at the World of Stuff, and they gotta get there quick. They arrive at the World of Stuff and see Mary's body being put into the back of an ambulance. They ask the paramedic what happened, who was played by Jeff Fried, who was known for My Mom's New Boyfriend and Beverly Hills 90210. He tells them that her heart must have just given up. Marshall and Simon head inside and see the ghost of Trip and Mary sitting at the booth together. Finally together. finally at peace. Simon almost got a picture of them too for evidence. Just then, Simon notices Marshall's crush and tells Marshall to go talk to her, but Marshall declines. Just then he hears Tripp's voice saying to go for it, and teleports Marshall on top of the bookshelf that Tripp was on. Marshall's crush says hi and what he's doing on top of the bookshelf. Marshall says it wasn't him, it was the ghost. Marshall was pretty nervous, but Tripp and Mary taught him what happens to people who wait too long, and he didn't want it to happen to him. So Marshall gets down and introduces himself to her. Later on, Marshall and Simon place the letter into the evidence locker and say the letter that was written 62 years ago has finally been delivered. And that concludes episode 9, and wow, what a story. These episodes keep getting better and better. The acting was great, and I love the jokes they placed in it. The story was sad in itself, but teaches a great lesson. Anyway, let me know what you thought of this episode, and if you remember this episode too. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.